Hi, Lori Goldman here. Welcome to For the Sake of the Argument. Today's guest was Ellie Savit, Washtenaw County Prosecutor, who's running for Attorney General of the state of Michigan. We talked today about what an Attorney General does, because I wasn't quite sure, and I'm sure you aren't either, and how he'd fight against the Trump administration's flagrant illegal actions if he's elected. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure to follow us at For the Sake of the Argument on social media. Enjoy the show. Hey, Ellie Savit, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I am glad that you're here. You're one of 3 Democratic candidates running for Attorney General of Michigan. Yet most Michiganders don't know what the Attorney General does. Can you, in layperson terms, fill us in?
So the Attorney General, as the name might suggest, is an attorney, the attorney for the state of Michigan. And the general part of that title really encapsulates the huge amount of duties that the AG has. But boiling it down, the Attorney General for the state of Michigan is the one actor that we elect that is supposed to represent in court the interests of the people of the state of Michigan. And that's true in everything ranging from criminal proceedings to civil rights proceedings to environmental and consumer protection and worker protection. And it's an incredibly important position, especially right now, because we're seeing the federal government step back from enforcing a lot of the federal laws that are meant to protect us. And we need a strong attorney general that's going to stand in the gap, go to court, and protect Michiganders.
You are currently the Washtenaw County prosecuting attorney. You were elected to a second term, and you won by 98%. Is that correct?
I think upwards of 98%. Now, it helped that nobody ran against me, but I did indeed win.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great. What are you going to be able to bring if you're elected Michigan's Attorney General? What will you bring from your experience as the Washtenaw County prosecutor to the job as Attorney General?
One is that in the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's Office, we treat serious crimes seriously, of course. We have built up specialized units dealing with domestic violence and sexual assault so that specially trained attorneys that are expert in those cases prosecute them from start to finish. We've built a cold case rape kit team that has gotten convictions and taken serial rapists off the street. But we've also done work that you don't normally think of prosecutors as doing. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is we have built up a specialized unit, which is the only one in a prosecutor's office in the entire state that focuses on consumer and worker protection. And this is really important, and it's something that I absolutely intend to focus on in the Attorney General's office. Because, Lori, do you know what the biggest category of theft in the United States is?
I don't.
It's wage theft, which means employers who are stealing from their employees.
Wow.
And in fact, if you add up every single type of theft in the United States, every pickpocket, every robbery, every time somebody rifles through your car and steals stuff, you add the value that Americans lose to all that type of theft up, wage theft, the amount of that Americans lose due to wage theft, it exceeds all of that combined. So this is a real issue. And I said, I want a specialized unit that is going to focus on this, right? That is going to go after employers who steal from their workers and who go after shady businesses who are price gouging consumers, who are engaging in deceptive advertising practices. And we've had a lot of success. We've gotten money back for workers. We've stopped consumer scams. We've got litigation ongoing right now against a landlord that is maintaining a 474-unit apartment building in horrendous conditions, and we've been able to get some preliminary relief for low-income tenants there. And that's the work that the AG needs to be doing. I'll say especially right now, because look, prices are high, families are struggling to get by, and I'm not going to lie and say the AG can magically bring prices down, right? Or can magically increase wages on our own. What we can do, and what we've been working towards in Washtenaw County, is we can make sure that shady business actors aren't taking advantage of this situation raising prices up higher in an illegal way. Shady companies aren't stealing from their workers, so they're not getting every cent that they're owned. Shady landlords aren't colluding with each other to raise prices on housing. And that's something that is unique to Washtenaw County that we've done in the prosecutor's office, an experience I will bring to the attorney general's office to bring that focus to the entire state. Now, I can go on about a number of our other initiatives, but we'd probably be here all day.
Okay, I just want to ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Give me a basic example of what wage theft is.
And there are so many ways that wage theft can occur. So I'll give you a couple. One is your boss says to you, Lori, I've got a set up for the day starting at 8 a.m. I know you don't clock in until 8:30. You wouldn't mind just coming in, helping me out a little bit before you clock in at 8 o'clock so we can set up for the day and things can get moving. A lot of people do that. They don't realize that they're entitled to get paid for that half an hour. A second way in which wage theft occurs, and this is something that is a little bit more subtle, is employers will misclassify their employees. They will call them independent contractors when in fact they are their employees. And the basic deal there is you're an employee rather than an independent contractor if you can't very well say no, if you don't really control your own schedule. Now, this is really important because, for example, when an employer says you're an independent contractor and not my employee, the employer is off the hook for paying their share of payroll taxes, and that obligation moves on to the person that should be classified as an employee. So it's a subtle way that employees or employers cheat their workers. And there's a whole host of other examples. But one of the things we did in Washtenaw County is we put out informational graphics. We worked in partnerships with our local labor unions and labor centers and put out informational graphics so people knew the various ways in which wage theft can occur. And I'd encourage folks to go to our social media platforms if you want specific examples of how wage theft happens.
Thanks for saying that. People are used to abuse in the workplace, so they don't know when it's occurring. That's very important. So, interesting fact about you, you've clerked for not one, but 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. What was that like? And how did you land those prestigious posts?
You've got to have a lot of good people in your corner, and you've got to be very lucky. I was fortunate enough to have mentors early on in my legal career that went to bat for me, that had connections with the justices. I also clerked for judges on the Court of Appeals, the United States Court of Appeals, and they made calls for me. I had professors that were in my corner. So I'm very fortunate and lucky to have had so many great people pushing for me, and then ultimately to have gotten the spot. Look, it was the honor of a lifetime to clerk for both of those trailblazing women, right? The first 2 women ever to serve on the Supreme Court. And, Justice O'Connor was retired by the time I clerked for her. And my work for her really involved helping her out with speeches and with law review articles and with something that was really close to her heart, which is civic education, which, boy, is something that we need now more than ever. For Justice Ginsburg, she was active. We were doing the work of the court. And the way that a clerkship works is every clerk is assigned a case for the justice. You'll prepare them for the cases. You'll write a memo saying how you think they should vote in the case. And if the justice gets the opinion in that case, you actually write the first draft of the opinion and have the opportunity to sit with, in this case, RBG and go through every single word in the opinion and make sure it's right and make sure that you're setting the right precedent. So just an absolutely tremendous experience. I learned a lot from both of them. And, of course, I think we all at this time miss RBG greatly, given what she brought to the court, her focus on equality and where the judiciary has been headed.
What do you think? Do you think she should have retired instead of opting to die in office?
It's a tough thing for me to talk about because had she retired when a replacement could have gotten through the U.S. Senate, I never would have clerked for her, right? The time to do it was after 2010.
We would have been willing to sacrifice you.
But that's what I was about to get to. Of course, I think that looking in hindsight, I don't think Justice Ginsburg anticipated the way that the country was going to move and the way that Senate elections and presidential elections were going to go. But certainly I think it would have been better for the country if, she had stepped down earlier and had Barack Obama appoint her replacement and been confirmed by the Democratic Senate.
You were an 8th grade teacher before becoming a prosecutor. What's harder? What was harder, getting 13-year-olds to listen to you or navigating Michigan politics?
I will say this. I've had a number of jobs after being an 8th grade teacher, and I've had really tough days, just like everybody does. I'm in a tough line of work. But at the end of the day, I can say, well, at least I wasn't dealing with 13-year-olds on a Friday after lunch, throwing paper balls at each other and just completely acting a fool. I loved teaching 8th grade, but the energy that you need to bring to an 8th grade classroom and to apply a calming presence is something that dwarfs anything else that I've done subsequently in my career.
Oh, it was a good boot camp for you then.
Exactly. If you can deal with 13-year-olds on their worst day, you can deal with anybody.
Don't you feel like you do deal with 13-year-olds when you're at work sometimes?
No comment.
Okay, good. You didn't want to prosecute the majority, and you didn't, of the student protesters during the ceasefire encampments.
Mm-hmm.
Was that decision meant to send a message to young people about supporting them? Or did you not want to go down the rabbit hole of criminalizing free speech and activism?
Yeah. So look, I've always taken the same position on protest and protest-related activity, no matter what the subject matter is, which is, by the way, something that I have to do, right? I can't pick and choose depending on what they're protesting for, because to do so would not just be a violation of professional ethics, but also content-based decisions based on speech, which would run afoul potentially of the First Amendment. So when you're making this decision, you have to take the subject matter out of the equation to the extent that you can. And my view on this is, look, protest and protest-related activity has been happening on college campuses for forever. And it's something that young people do, something that young people have done. And, civil disobedience at times crosses technically the line into where you could bring charges. But my view of that is it's not something that requires the criminal system's involvement. There needs to be consequences. The university can deal with it. That's how a lot of stuff has historically been dealt with. And that was the perspective that I took in these cases as well, especially in the ones that we declined, right? So, and I got to say too, it's a broader philosophy that I have as well. Young people are going to make mistakes, and if we're going to bring criminal charges, we better be able to explain exactly why we're doing that and what we hope to accomplish. Now, the fact that you are protesting, of course, doesn't immunize you from following other generally applicable laws. And so if, for example, you engage in assaultive behavior or you're destroying property, doing stuff that harms others, that's something that does have to be prosecuted, even if it does come in the context of protest-related activity. But if, you're doing a sit-in, which was the case for the majority of the cases that we dealt with, if you're doing a sit-in, right, technically there's trespassing there, right, can bring charges, but it's just not something that I feel needs to be in the criminal system. And that's the perspective that we took. And I've stuck to that.
My follow-up was, would you have done anything different? In hindsight, I think you've answered that. And what you learned, I think you've answered that. This is going to get more and more commonplace. And unfortunately, in this instance, both sides, I felt like they were not fully supported. It's a hard needle to thread, and I don't envy you having to do that in the future, but thank you for your answer. You've created a special victims and domestic violence unit in the Washtenaw Prosecutor's Office, and you alluded to this earlier. You've recently prosecuted a cold case, rape case, that ended in a 28 to 46-year sentence for the rapist. Tell us why you're passionate about that, why you think it's important to have these dedicated divisions dealing with these women's issues.
Absolutely. And the reason for that is because intimate partner violence and sexual violence often involve complexities that you frankly don't see regularly in other cases. When somebody is the victim of intimate partner violence in particular, there can be a lot of coercion being placed on them by their partner, by family members of the partner. And this coercion can not just be physical violence, though, of course, that's where it crosses the line into a domestic violence charge under Michigan law. But it can be things like financial coercion, right? If your finances are tied up with your abuser. It can be things like coercion relating to children that you may have in common and threatening to use family courts, right, and child custody proceedings against you if you don't decline to show up to court. And it's really important in these cases that we have specialized prosecutors who understand deeply domestic violence dynamics, who also understand the potentially lethal consequences of intimate partner violence, particularly as it relates to guns. I'll give you a statistic. The presence of a firearm in a domestic violence situation increases the risk of homicide by 500%.
Wow.
So when we're dealing with these cases, even though some of them are classified as misdemeanors under state law, we need to have prosecutors and victim advocates who are specially trained up, who recognizes these dynamics, who recognize the potential coercive control that the victim may be experiencing, and who recognize the signs of potential lethality in that domestic violence situation. So we were able to get funding and we were able to get the support of our Board of Commissioners to build up a specialized domestic violence unit, which is the first time Washtenaw County has had that in decades. And it's something that I'm extremely passionate about, because prosecuting those cases the right way and giving victims and survivors of intimate partner violence support they need, that's saving lives. That's preventing tragedies from happening.
You talk a lot about putting programs in place, and you have, to prevent future crimes before they happen, or I would say to prevent future criminals or better criminals. Tell us about that program or that philosophy.
When we are prosecuting a case, when the police and prosecutors are involved, we've already failed as a community. Because by definition, when there's a prosecution going on or there's a police investigation going on, it means something bad has already happened. And we do our job. I want to be very clear about that. We will prosecute serious offenses, right? We have extremely talented attorneys who get some semblance of justice for victims. But at the end of that trial, let's say it's a homicide case. At the end of a homicide trial, we congratulate, we take pride in a job well done when we get a conviction, and we do. But at the end of this, we've still got somebody who has lost their life, a family that is still grieving. We're not able to bring that person back. On the other side of the equation, we're sending somebody to prison for decades or possibly the rest of their life. It's a tragedy. Far better as a community that we work together to prevent that violence and those tragedies from occurring in the first instance. And this is why I'm proud that we have secured funding to, for example, support community violence interruption work in our community, which involves, credible messengers that live in the community going out and when something is about to happen, actually playing peacemaker, right? And telling perhaps younger people, you got to put the guns down. And this works. It works not just in Washtenaw County, but we're sitting here right now in Detroit, right? And Detroit, in areas that CVI, community violence interruption work, has been going on. They've seen significant historic drops in homicides. And we've seen that in Washtenaw County as well. We had a 50% reduction in homicides just over the last year. The other thing that we do in the prosecutor's office is, look, there are some lower level offenses that come in and they don't immediately pose a threat to community safety, but we can see that there's an underlying issue there. Maybe it's a mental health issue. Maybe it's a substance use issue. And yeah, for these are largely misdemeanors. Probably nobody's going to jail anyway. We can put them on probation. We can try to get them services. But here's the thing. When we do that, they've got a criminal conviction, right? And when you got a criminal conviction, it's going to be harder for you to get a job, to continue your education, to get housing. Do this all the time in the justice system. We say, well, we need to get a conviction so we can get somebody on probation and get them services and get them help, right? And it's I think people have the best of intentions when they do that. We're not taking stock of the collateral consequences. So one thing we did early on in 2021 was we said, well, why don't we rewind this? And if we're just trying to get somebody help and get them services, we know they've got an underlying issue, why don't we give them an off-ramp before they even plead guilty to a crime and set them up with an individualized plan and say, look, if you do everything we ask you to do and you don't commit a new criminal offense, we'll just dismiss this case entirely and you won't ever have to say that you pleaded guilty to a crime on that job application or that housing application or when you're trying to continue your education. Now, look, I'm from Washtenaw County. I'm from Ann Arbor. And I know to a lot of people sometimes talk about this stuff, people say that sounds like progressive fairy tale nonsense, right? There needs to be harsh consequences, right? And you need to send a message. Well, I'm also a numbers guy, right? And we've had nearly 200 people that have gone through this program, this pre-plea program where we get people an off-ramp and get them help. And an independent study was done of those that completed, which the vast, vast majority of them do. Independent study was done. The recidivism rate was literally 0%, meaning not a single person in that program that successfully completed it reoffended. That is keeping the community safe in the long term. That is preventing crime. And by the way, it's also doing right by the people that are involved in our justice system.
You've presided over many cases in your career as a prosecutor. Can you share with us what's one that kept you up at night?
You know, the cases that keep me up at night repeatedly are those involving young people. In every county, I think there's a handful of young people that are really going down the wrong path. When guns are involved, I'm particularly concerned about that. And the truth of the matter is that for a lot of these kids, they were early on in their childhood the victims of significant trauma. We had a study done of our juvenile justice system in Washtenaw County, and they were looking at racial disparities, but they thought to compare the kids that are in our delinquency system that are, accused of sort of more serious offenses with earlier cases involving neglect and abuse, which our office also handles. And they said, 70% plus of the kids that are in the delinquency system were previously, when they were younger, the subject of a neglect and abuse petition, right? Meaning they were neglected and abused. And I went to my juvenile team, which is headed by a wonderful attorney who's a longtime prosecutor and has been doing this work for decades. And I said, can you believe this, right? Because we're not even counting the ones where there was no reporting or where they experienced trauma that may not have qualified as domestic or neglect and abuse, such as experiencing a shooting, something like that. I said, can you believe this? This is staggering. And she goes, that's about what I would have expected. Because I see these same kids, these same families. She handles both sides of it.
Wow.
And that keeps me up at night. We've got to do more to make sure that kids, when they're getting in trouble, that we can actually get them on the right path and we can keep the community safe as a state. And again, this is not a Washtenaw County issue. I talk to my colleagues across the state on this. But it also really demonstrates just how much we could prevent if early on we were effectively dealing with that trauma that young children experience. Again, it's about crime prevention, right? And if we can address that at the outset, we'd see the dividends from that in 10, 15 years.
If you are successful and you're elected as Michigan's next Attorney General, what will your top priority be?
We have not talked all that much, actually, about everything that is going on in this country right now, coming out of Washington, D.C. But I think that anybody that is running for this position right now and does not make fighting back against the unlawful actions that we're seeing out of Washington a top priority is missing the moment. At the very start of this podcast, you asked me to define what the Attorney General does. And I said, look, the AG is the one actor that can go into court and represent the people of the state of Michigan when they are being harmed. And a lot of illegal harm is coming out of Washington, D.C. right now. We are seeing the dismantling, the intentional dismantling of our civil rights, of protections that are in place for the environment, of worker and consumer protection. I can go on. And a lot of this is flatly illegal. I will just give one example that I don't think is a tough case. One of the very first executive orders that the president signed was this birthright citizenship order, which seeks to rewrite the constitutional text of the 14th Amendment through an executive order, which, you remember I said I was an 8th grade teacher. You said I was an 8th grade teacher. I think all of my 8th graders would have gotten that right. Can the president rewrite the Constitution through an executive order? Answer, no. But that's what President Trump is doing. It's flatly illegal. It's insulting to people who have been born in this country and been citizens by birth for hundreds of years and have served in our military and have served as first responders and are our teachers and our medical professionals and contribute in innumerable ways to our community. It's also screwing over states. And this is a subtle point that a lot of people don't really recognize. But when you say that a child born in this country is no longer a citizen, there's a whole host of federal programs, nutritional benefits and special education benefits and the like, that a child has to be a citizen in order to get federal funding for. So this birthright citizenship order is not just grievously illegal, not just grievously insulting, but it's also hurting states directly and hurting everybody in Michigan, because we're going to have, if it were to go into effect, we would have a stateless class of children who would be unable to access needed services that they need to thrive. And that's the kind of thing that state AGs absolutely need to be in court standing up against. Our current AG has been doing a great job doing that, right? But that's got to be a priority for the next attorney general, because I don't see the illegality coming out of the Trump administration stopping anytime soon. I will say we've already been involved, joining with cities and counties and supporting challenges to illegal Trump administration actions. I'm going to continue doing that as AG, and we've got to meet the moment, because nothing less than our democracy itself is at stake right now.
Hallelujah. Yeah, thank you. All right, now we have Gina's lightning round. Are you ready for this? This is the hardest part.
So. Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's just, there used to be a seatbelt on that chair. The last interviewee burst out of it. What's worse, in your opinion, cash bail or mandatory minimum sentences?
Cash bail. And I'll tell you why. I believe that if somebody is dangerous to the community, they should be held pending trial, and if not, they shouldn't. Cash bail is a system that it depends on the size of your bank account, whether you're being held. It means a rich person who's actually very, very, very dangerous, if they got $1 million, they can go free. And we talked about domestic violence earlier and intimate partner violence. There's a lot of rich perpetrators of intimate partner violence. And remember, we talked about how lethal that is. Mm-hmm. I don't care if you've got $1 million or if you've got $2 million. If we think you're dangerous, you should be held, just like it happens in the federal system, just like happens in other states. And by contrast, if you are poor and you are accused of a very low-level offense and you don't have $250 to pay your bond, you shouldn't have to sit in jail for days or weeks or months and your family be out what you would be able to provide for them. So we just got to get wealth out of the equation entirely.
What do you think is more intimidating to you, arguing in court on a tough case, or tweeting about Gaza as an elected official and a Jewish person?
Probably the latter.
Yeah, I would agree. What's the last show that you binge watched to detox from your stressful life? Okay, this doesn't exactly detox anything, but I've been catching up on Black Mirror. I love the new season. You know, some of the last couple of seasons, they got a little bit wonky, but the new season is fantastic. It gets back to Black Mirror's roots. And by the way, not to be too cute here, but AI and the challenges posed by AI is something the next Attorney General is going to have to deal with as well. Oh, that's a good point. What's one law you'd, and I don't say 86 anymore, I say 46 as a negative, from books, the law books, if you had the power? One law that you'd get out of the books. I would zap our cruel constitutional amendment that was passed in the early 2000s, which defines marriage as between one man and one woman. Because unfortunately, if Obergefell is overturned and the Supreme Court retreats from marriage equality, just like we saw with abortion in the state of Michigan, that old law, which basically makes it illegal for same-sex marriage to
occur in the state of Michigan would spring back into effect without that federal protection. We've got to get rid of that provision as a defensive move. I think there should be a ballot initiative which does precisely that. But if you give me the power to do it, I'm zapping it right now.
If that were to spring back into effect, does that invalidate any marriages between same-sex couples?
I would hope not. I would hope not. But it would really depend on how the Supreme Court of the United States wrote any opinion retreating from marriage equality, as well as how states interpret it. I will say that, fortunately, at least in Michigan, if this is left up to the state Supreme Courts, we've got an excellent Supreme Court, 6-1 Democratic appointees and nominees. So those judicial elections are really, really important.
Absolutely. Last question. Who's your legal hero? And who do you consider a legal fraud? And you're not leaving until you answer both.
Oh, okay. Well, look, my legal hero, I have to say RBG. And I'll tell you a little bit about why. Her career was premised on fundamental notions of equality. Even before she was a judge or a justice. She enshrined sex equality into the Constitution through her litigation strategy. And she just believed in equality so deeply and believed that was the fount of so much in our Constitution. But she was also a brilliant tactician, right? And you got to be a brilliant tactician when you're a lawyer. When she was arguing sex equality cases, she was arguing in front of an all-male Supreme Court. And how do you convince an all-male Supreme Court that has had all the advantages of sex stereotyping, that this is actually a bad thing and that the Constitution actually protects against sex-based discrimination? Well, what she did was she found the cases in which sex stereotyping and sex-based classifications hurt men, right? For example, in Oklahoma law that said that women could buy beer at 18, but men had to wait till they were 21, right? And the male justices in the Supreme Court, they understood that's not fair, right? And once you do that, you've established the precedent and you've enshrined sex equality into the Constitution. But she knew her audience, right? And she was about winning. And so she was just a brilliant tactician. And the other thing I'll say is even when I was working for her as a justice, she'd been a judge and a justice in sort of marble palaces, removed from the day-to-day of court for a very long time, but she always kept the human beings that were at the center of every case front and center. One night I was with her late because she was a night owl working on something. And I had a memo that I was supposed to give her, and I gave her the memo. I dropped it off, and she was working on this other case. It wasn't even mine. It was assigned to a co-clerk of mine. It's a case nobody's ever heard of. It's an immigration case, actually. Minor case, didn't generate a lot of headlines. But there was a person at the center of it. And I was the last one in the building. And she just talked to me for 45 minutes about how unfair this was if this person was going to get deported, how it was going to affect his family, how it was going to affect his life. She was just sitting in that office, not thinking about legal doctrine, not thinking about the law. She was thinking about this person. And that's something that every lawyer, I think, and especially lawyers in positions of government authority, need to be considering every single day, because even if it's something that you might consider minor or routine, it is something that very well could be the most important thing in an individual human being's life.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much, Ellie Savit, for taking time out to be with us today. I really appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate being on here.